The first time my father-in-law laughed at me in front of everyone. He said a man is only worth what he brings home, and the room joined in like it was a punchline. I remember thinking, if that is true, then why does it feel like something is being taken from me right now? It happened at a family dinner long before Christmas, but that sentence stayed with me. It followed me like a bad smell you cannot wash off. By the time the Christmas night came, when everything finally broke, I had heard some version of it so many times that I could predict the rhythm of the laughter before it started. My name is Aaron Coley. I am 43 years old. I fix industrial machines for a living. Not the shiny kind you see on commercials, the kind that keeps warehouses running and hospitals from going dark. I work with my hands, and I come home tired. I have never been ashamed of that. I was raised to believe that showing up and doing honest work mattered more than how your car looked in a parking lot. My wife used to believe that too. Her name is Claire. We met 12 years ago at a county fundraiser in Western Ohio. She laughed easily back then. She liked that I knew how to take things apart and put them back together. She said it made her feel safe. When we married, her family smiled through it, but I could tell they thought it was a phase she would grow out of. Her father, Mark Ellison, made his money in commercial property, warehouses and office parks that looked identical from the road. He liked to talk about deals at dinner. He liked to ask what you drove and where you vacationed. When he asked what I did, and I told him, he nodded slowly, like he was listening to a child explain a dream. Then he said something about potential and changed the subject. Over the years, potential turned into jokes. Jokes turned into comments. Comments turned into open contempt. He never raised his voice. He did not need to. He had an audience and an easy confidence that came from never being told no. His wife, Linda, watched quietly. She had a way of smiling that made you feel smaller. Claire would squeeze my hand under the table at first. Later, she stopped. I learned to eat faster at their dinners. I learned to keep my eyes on my plate. When Mark started in, I would tell myself it did not matter, that love was enough, that Claire knew who I was, even if they did not. I believed that until the silence between us at home started to feel heavier than the noise at her parents' house. The Christmas dinner was supposed to be a reset. That is what Claire said when she told me to wear my best jacket. She sounded tired. The restaurant was called Harbor Room, and it sat on the edge of a frozen river. White lights in the windows, valet out front, the kind of place where the menus feel heavier than they should. There were a lot of people there. Business partners, cousins, friends of friends. Everyone dressed like they were going somewhere important after. I took my seat and tried to be polite. The conversation flowed around me. Numbers, projects, someone bragging about a new condo in Florida. I nodded when it felt right. Mark waited until the main course. He always did. He tapped his glass and made a toast about family and new beginnings. Then he looked at me. He asked how work was. I said steady. He smiled and said, steady is what you say when you do not want to admit you are stuck. Laughter rolled down the table. I felt my face heat up, but I kept still. Linda leaned in and said she only worried about Claire, about her future, about security. She said it gently. That was worse. Claire stared at the tablecloth. She did not look at me. She did not look at them either. She looked somewhere far away. Then she reached into her purse and slid an envelope across the table toward me. It was plain. No note. My name written in her careful handwriting. I knew what it was before I touched it. My hands felt numb when I opened it. The words were clean and final. Papers signed days earlier. She had made the decision without me. I looked up at her. She said she was sorry, but it sounded practiced. Mark stood up. He raised his glass and said it was about time. He said I would need to be out of the house by February. He said it like a joke, and the room answered him. People clapped. On Christmas night, they clapped while my marriage ended. Something settled in me then. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. I folded the papers and set them down. A server came by to clear plates. I told him I would take care of the bill for everyone. He hesitated. Mark laughed loud and said, "Let the man try." Claire whispered my name like a warning. I reached into my jacket and handed the server a card I had carried for years and never used. He glanced at it and froze. He looked at me again like he was seeing me for the first time. He said he needed to check something and walked away quickly. The table went quiet in a way I had never felt before. No jokes, no clinking glasses, just waiting. I sat there with my hands folded and my breathing steady. I thought about all the times I had swallowed words to keep the peace. I thought about what my mother taught me about dignity. I did not know exactly what would happen next. I only knew that I was done being invisible. The door at the back of the room opened and someone stepped out. People turned in their chairs. Claire finally looked at me. There was confusion in her eyes. Fear, too. I met her gaze and then looked back at the doorway as the man walked toward our table, and the room seemed to hold its breath. He stopped a few feet from our table and said my name quietly, not to announce it, but to confirm it. And that sound pulled me backward through years I had spent trying to convince myself that things were not as bad as they felt. Before the jokes turned sharp, and before silence became a language between Claire and me, there was a time when our marriage felt solid. Not perfect, but honest. We met when we were both still figuring things out. I was working long shifts fixing machines that most people never noticed unless they broke. She was building a career in communications, helping companies sound confident even when they were not. We respected each other. At least I thought we did. In the early years, she defended me. When her father made comments about ambition or money, she pushed back. She said I worked harder than anyone she knew. She said character mattered. I remember one dinner when she stood up and said she was proud of me. The room went quiet then too, but it felt different. That was the version of her I married. But pride is fragile when it is tested often enough. Over time, the comments became routine. Mark never said the same thing twice. But the message was always clear. He talked about stability and long-term planning. He talked about what a real provider looked like. Linda nodded along and added questions that sounded harmless but carried weight. How long could I keep doing physical work? What happened if I got hurt? Was Claire prepared for that kind of uncertainty? At first, Claire brushed it off. Then she started repeating their questions at home. Not as accusations, just concerns. She asked if I had thought about moving into management. She asked if I wanted to go back to school. I told her I liked my work. I told her we were doing fine. We paid our bills. We saved what we could. We did not need their lifestyle to be happy. She listened, but I could tell she was measuring my answers against something else. Against the life she grew up with. Against the image her parents held up every time we saw them. I started to notice small changes. She checked her phone more at dinner. She talked less about her day. When I tried to tell her about a job that went well, she smiled, but her eyes drifted. We argued more, but never loudly. Our disagreements were quiet and exhausting. She said she felt caught in the middle. She said her parents were only worried about her. I said that worry should not come at the cost of respect. We both felt unheard. The space between us grew, without either of us naming it. I tried to fix it the way I fix machines. By working harder. I took on extra jobs. I stayed late. I came home smelling like oil and metal, proud of the work I had done. I thought if I could show progress, it would ease her doubts. Instead, it seemed to confirm them. She asked why I was never home, She said I was choosing work over us. I did not know how to explain that I was choosing us the only way I knew how. The nights became quieter. We stopped planning things. We stopped talking about the future. When we lay in bed together, she faced the other way. I told myself this was just a phase, that marriages go through stretches like this, that if I stayed steady, it would pass. The dinners at her parents' house became harder to sit through. Claire stopped squeezing my hand. When Mark started in, she looked down at her plate. When Linda talked about other couples and their successes, Claire nodded. I felt like I was watching her drift away, one dinner at a time. The night I realized how far gone things were did not come with shouting or slammed doors. It came with a look. We were driving home after a holiday visit. Mark had made a comment about how lucky Claire was to have options. Linda had said something about second chances. I asked Claire what that meant. She stared out the window and said nothing. The silence answered me. After that, I paid closer attention. I noticed how often she talked to her mother, how she took calls in the other room, how she ended conversations quickly when I walked in. I did not accuse her of anything. I did not want to be the kind of man who jumped to conclusions. I trusted her. Or maybe I was afraid of what I would find if I did not. There were moments when she seemed like herself again. We would laugh over something small. She would reach for my arm when she thought no one was watching. Those moments kept me hopeful. They made the rest easier to tolerate. I held on to them like proof that what we had was still there. But hope without action turns into waiting, and waiting wears you down. I started to feel like a guest in my own life. I went to work. I came home. I slept. I did not complain. I did not ask for more than I was given. I thought that was what being a good husband meant. Looking back now, I see how much I accepted in the name of peace. How many times I swallowed my pride because I believed love meant endurance. I told myself that walking away would mean I failed, that standing my ground would only push her further toward them. So I stayed quiet. The week before Christmas, she was distant in a way that felt final. She avoided my eyes. She answered questions with short words. When I asked if something was wrong, she said she was just tired. I believed her because believing her was easier than pressing for the truth. One night I woke up and realized she was not in bed. I heard her voice from the living room. Low. Careful. She did not know I was awake. I did not mean to listen. But once I heard my name, I could not stop. She spoke about choices, about listening earlier, about not wanting to make the same mistake twice. She said she felt pressure. She said she was trying to do the right thing. I stood there in the hallway and felt something inside me crack. Not loudly. Quietly. Like a hairline fracture that spreads when you put weight on it. I did not confront her. I did not interrupt the call. I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling until she returned and lay down beside me, like nothing had happened. The next morning she acted normal. She asked what I wanted for breakfast. She smiled when I kissed her cheek. I played along because I did not know what else to do. The conversation replayed in my head all day. I wondered how long she had been planning whatever came next. I wondered how long I had been out of the conversation. That was when I started to understand that silence is not always patience. Sometimes it is surrender, and sometimes it is preparation. When she told me later that week about the Christmas dinner reservation, about wearing something nice, about being there as a family, I agreed without hesitation. Not because I believed it would fix anything, but because I needed to see it through. I did not know exactly what I was walking into that night. I only knew that something had already ended, and something else was about to begin, whether I was ready for it or not. Once I admitted to myself that something had already ended. The days that followed felt unreal, like I was moving through rooms I no longer owned. I went to work and did my job on autopilot. I showed up before sunrise, checked the machines, replaced worn parts, signed off on inspections. The guys I worked with asked about my plans for the holidays. I said the usual things: family dinner, quiet night, nothing special. I did not tell anyone that my chest felt hollow or that my hands shook when I was alone. On my drive home each night, I kept replaying the sound of Claire's voice from that phone call. Not angry, not cruel, calm, certain. That was the part that hurt the most. There was no fight to win back, no misunderstanding to clear up. She had already stepped somewhere I could not follow. That was when I started thinking about Thomas Hale again. Most people would have called him my uncle. But he was never that by blood. He was my mother's closest friend, a man who stepped in when my father disappeared and my mother worked double shifts to keep us afloat. Thomas taught me how to fix things before I was old enough to drive. He believed that if you could understand how something broke, you could usually figure out how to make it whole again. He lived alone outside Dayton in a small place surrounded by trees. No neighbors close by. No signs of money. When I was younger, I spent weekends there helping him repair whatever needed attention. Fences, old equipment, the kind of work that left you sore and satisfied at the same time. Thomas never talked much about himself. He asked questions and listened. When I told him I was marrying Claire, he smiled and said love is simple until people make it complicated. When I told him her family did not think much of me, he nodded and said they probably thought they knew how the world worked. There was one conversation with him that came back to me that week. We were sitting on his porch, hands wrapped around coffee mugs. He told me something about preparing for storms before the sky turns dark. He said most people wait until the damage is obvious. The smart ones make quiet decisions early. I did not understand what he meant at the time. I told him my marriage was fine. He did not argue. He just said, make sure you are not confusing patience with fear. That sentence stayed with me long after he passed. Thomas died 3 years ago. A short illness. No drama. No grand farewell. I helped settle his affairs the way he asked. Simple. Clean. He left me a few things that mattered. Tools. Letters. And one responsibility I did not fully understand but agreed to carry. At the time, it felt symbolic. Something to honor him. I never imagined it would intersect with my life the way it was about to. The closer Christmas came, the more distant Claire became. She packed carefully. She made lists. She avoided conversations that lasted more than a few sentences. When I tried to talk about us, she said, not now. After the holidays? That phrase repeated itself until it felt meaningless. I stopped pushing. I stopped asking. I focused on getting through each day without saying something I could not take back. There is a point where asking for honesty feels like begging, and I refused to cross it. The morning of Christmas Eve, I found myself in the garage staring at the workbench. My tools were laid out the way I liked them. Clean, ordered, reliable. I realized how much comfort I took in things that behaved the way they were supposed to. Machines fail for reasons. People fail for reasons too. But they are harder to trace. Claire came in and asked if I could fix the latch on her suitcase. It kept sticking. I did it without a word. She thanked me and watched me longer than necessary. For a moment I thought she might say something real. She did not. She picked up the suitcase and went back inside. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling again. I wondered if she felt any of this, if she was struggling the way I was, or if she had already moved on emotionally and was just waiting for the right moment to make it official. I wondered how long I had been the only one trying. When morning came, I dressed slowly. My best jacket hung in the closet, untouched for years. I brushed off the shoulders and put it on. Claire looked at me and nodded. She said, "You look nice." It sounded polite, not personal. The drive to the restaurant was quiet. Snow lined the roads. The sky was low and gray. I watched the landscape pass and thought about how many times I had driven this same route, hoping the destination would feel different. The harbor room rose out of the riverbank like something meant to impress. Lights reflected off the ice. Valets moved with purpose. People stepped out of cars dressed like they were arriving at a celebration instead of a reckoning. Inside, the air smelled like polished wood and wine. We were led to a private room at the back. I recognized faces from past gatherings. People who smiled when they saw Claire and barely registered my presence. Mark was already there, laughing loudly. Linda sat beside him, composed as ever. As we took our seats, Mark leaned over and said something about good timing and fresh starts. I nodded. Claire sat down and placed her purse carefully on the table. I noticed how deliberate her movements were, like she was following a script. Dinner began the way it always did. Small talk, updates, business wins. Mark talked about a new acquisition. Someone congratulated him. Linda asked Claire about her work. Claire answered smoothly. When the conversation turned to me, it was brief and shallow. How is work? Busy? Good. Then on to the next topic. I felt detached, like I was watching myself from across the room. I wondered if this was what Thomas meant about storms, about seeing the damage coming and choosing how to stand when it hits. As the plates were cleared and the room grew louder, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The tension that had lived in my chest for weeks loosened its grip. Whatever was going to happen tonight was going to happen whether I was ready or not. I took a slow breath and looked around the table. Faces flushed from wine, conversations overlapping, laughter rising and falling. No one noticed the moment everything shifted inside me. No one could have known that I had already accepted what was coming. When Claire reached into her purse later and slid the envelope across the table, it did not surprise me. It hurt, but it did not shock me. I'd been standing at the edge of that moment for days. What surprised me was how quiet I felt afterward. How steady my hands were when I folded the papers. How clear my thoughts became when Mark stood up and made his toast. It was like the noise finally stopped, and I could hear myself think. As the applause faded and the server approached, I realized that whatever came next would not be about proving anything to them. It would be about choosing what I was willing to carry forward and what I was finally ready to set down. The room shifted again when the server left our table in a hurry. Chairs creaked, voices lowered. Eyes followed him toward the door. I sat back and waited, knowing that the night had not finished revealing itself yet. The silence after the server hurried away felt heavier than the applause that came before it. Like the room was waiting to see who would move first. Mark broke it with a laugh that sounded forced even to his own ears. He leaned back in his chair and said something about cards declining and embarrassing scenes. A few people chuckled out of habit, but it did not spread the way laughter usually does. It fell flat and died quickly. Linda touched his arm and whispered something meant only for him, though her eyes kept drifting back to me. Claire finally turned toward me. Her face had lost its color. She asked what I was doing and told me to stop. Her voice was low but sharp, the way it used to sound when she corrected me in front of her parents without making a scene. I met her eyes and said nothing. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel the urge to explain myself. The minutes stretched. The hum of conversation from the other dining rooms filtered through the walls, reminding us that the world outside this room was still moving normally. Inside, everything felt suspended. Someone at the far end of the table cleared their throat. Another checked their phone. No one quite knew where to look. Mark leaned forward and asked if I thought this was funny. He said I had already made enough of a mess tonight, and there was no need to drag it out. His tone carried the same authority it always had. The assumption that his voice decided when things began and ended. I noticed for the first time how used he was to being obeyed. I thought about answering him. I thought about all the replies I had practiced in my head over the years. None of them seemed necessary anymore. I rested my hands on the table and waited. The door at the back of the room opened again, this time more deliberately. The server returned, his expression different from before, straighter, careful. He stepped aside to let another man enter. The conversation stopped completely now. Chairs turned, heads lifted. The man wore a dark suit and carried himself like someone used to being listened to. He scanned the room quickly, then looked straight at me. He said my name quietly, as if confirming a detail. I nodded. He introduced himself as the general manager of the restaurant. His tone was respectful in a way that caught everyone off guard. He said there had been a question about the account I had presented and that he needed to speak with me briefly. He did not ask me to step outside. He did not lower his voice. He spoke as though this was the most normal thing in the world. Mark bristled. He demanded to know what was going on. The manager did not acknowledge him. Claire's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She looked from the manager to me and back again. I could see the questions forming in her eyes. Questions she had never asked before. The manager said there was a call that needed to be made to confirm a few details. He asked if I was comfortable with that happening here. I said yes. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. He nodded and pulled out his phone as he stepped a few feet away to make the call. The room filled with a low murmur. Mark leaned toward Linda and whispered urgently. She shook her head, confusion breaking through her composure. Someone down the table asked what this was about. No one answered. I sat there and felt oddly calm. The part of me that used to brace for impact was quiet. I thought about Thomas again. About the way he used to say that control is not about making noise. It is about knowing when you do not need to. The manager spoke into the phone in short sentences. He listened more than he talked. His posture shifted slightly as the call went on. When he hung up, he did not put the phone away immediately. He took a breath, then turned back toward the table. He said there had been a misunderstanding earlier and that it was now resolved. He said that according to their records, I was authorized to handle matters related to the property. He used careful language, legal language. He did not mention money. He did not mention ownership. He spoke about authority and responsibility. Mark stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. He said this was ridiculous. He said there had to be some mistake. He said he had been doing business with this place for years. The manager listened politely, then said that tenure did not override documentation. Claire looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. She asked me quietly what he meant. I told her it meant exactly what he said. Nothing more, nothing less. Linda asked if this had something to do with Thomas Hale. The name landed softly but carried weight. I looked at her, surprised. She explained that she had heard Mark mention him once in a business context years ago. A quiet investor, a name that came up in certain circles but never stayed long. The manager nodded and said that was correct. He said Mr. Hale had been very specific about how things were to be handled and when certain protocols were to be followed. He said tonight met those conditions. A few people exchanged looks. Whispers started again, this time edged with uncertainty. Mark's face had gone red. He demanded details. He demanded answers. The manager said those would come through the appropriate channels. Not here. I felt Claire shift beside me. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For once, she seemed unsure of what to say. I wondered if she was replaying our past conversations in her head, looking for the moment where she might have asked a different question. The manager asked if there was anything else I needed this evening. The question hung there. I thought about what I wanted. I thought about what I no longer needed. I told him to proceed with settling the bill as discussed. He nodded and said it would be taken care of. Mark scoffed and said this was far from over. He said lawyers would get involved. He said people do not get to embarrass him and walk away. His voice cracked slightly on the last part. I realized how much of his confidence depended on never being challenged in public. I turned toward him then. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult him. I told him this was not about embarrassment. It was about clarity. I told him that tonight was not the start of something new. It was the end of something that had been breaking for a long time. The room stayed quiet. No one clapped. No one laughed. People watched, waiting to see if there would be more. There was not. The manager excused himself and left the room again. Conversations did not resume. People shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact. Others stared openly now, curiosity replacing contempt. I stood up slowly. Claire looked up at me. She said my name. Softer this time. I told her we would talk later, but not tonight. I told her there were things that could not be unsaid, and tonight had said enough. I picked up my jacket and draped it over my arm. I looked around the table one last time. Faces that had once dismissed me now looked uncertain. I did not feel triumphant. I felt finished. As I walked toward the door, I heard Mark say something sharp behind me. I did not turn around. The hallway outside the dining room felt cooler, quieter. My footsteps echoed as I moved away from the noise and into something that felt like space. I pushed open the door leading out toward the lobby and felt the cold air from outside seep in. For the first time that night, I took a full breath. I did not know what the morning would bring or how the pieces would fall, but I knew I had crossed a line I would not step back over. Behind me, the door closed softly, leaving the room and everything in it on the other side. The cold hit my face as soon as I stepped into the lobby, sharp and clean, like it was trying to wake me up from a long sleep I did not know I was in. People moved around me in coats and scarves, laughing, checking phones, living their own nights. None of them knew what had just happened in that private room. None of them cared. I stood there for a moment, holding my jacket, listening to the sound of my own breathing slow down. I thought Claire might follow me. Part of me expected to hear her footsteps, to feel her hand on my arm the way she used to do when things felt uncertain. That did not happen. The doors behind me stayed closed. I walked out toward the river. The lights from the restaurant reflected off the ice, broken and uneven. I leaned against the railing and let the cold sink into my bones. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had spent so many years bracing myself for moments like this that when it finally happened, my body seemed to know exactly what to do. A few minutes passed. I did not check my phone. I did not replay the conversation in my head. I just stood there and let the noise drain out of me. When I finally turned back, a man was standing a few steps away. The general manager. His coat was buttoned now, his posture more relaxed. He said my name again, this time less formal. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine. He said there would be paperwork to follow. Not tonight, not tomorrow. He said someone would reach out to me in the coming days to go over details. He apologized for the way things had unfolded in front of so many people. I told him it was not his fault. He hesitated. then said Thomas Hale had been very clear about how he wanted things handled. He said Thomas believed that dignity mattered, that there were moments when discretion was less important than clarity. He said tonight was one of those moments. I nodded. Hearing Thomas's name spoken that way made my chest tighten. I thanked the manager and watched him walk back toward the building. I did not go back inside. I got in my truck and drove. I did not have a destination in mind. I just needed motion. The roads were quiet. Snow packed along the shoulders, streetlights stretching long shadows across the pavement. As I drove, the past few hours began to replay in fragments. Mark's laugh, the applause, Claire's face when the manager spoke my name. The shift in the room when people realized the story they had been telling themselves about me no longer fit. I did not feel satisfaction. I did not feel like I had won anything. What I felt was distance, like I had finally stepped far enough away to see things clearly. I pulled into a gas station outside town and sat there with the engine running. I checked my phone then. 3 missed calls, all from Claire, a text from Linda that said we need to talk, a voicemail from Mark that I did not listen to. I turned the phone face down and rested my forehead against the steering wheel. For years, those names on my screen would have sent a rush of anxiety through me. Tonight they felt like echoes from a room I had already left. I thought about going home. Then I realized I did not know what home was anymore. The house Claire and I shared suddenly felt like neutral ground at best. A place filled with things we bought together and silences we built together. I drove instead to my shop. It was nothing special. A rented space on the edge of town with concrete floors and fluorescent lights. The place smelled like oil and metal and dust. Familiar. Honest. I unlocked the door and flipped on the lights. The machines sat where I left them. Tools hung on the wall in neat rows. I took off my jacket and set it on the chair. The quiet there was different from the quiet at the restaurant. It did not feel heavy. It felt earned. I sat down on a stool and stared at my hands. These hands had fixed things for decades. They had paid for that house, for that life, for every dinner where I swallowed my words. They had never embarrassed me. I stayed there longer than I meant to. At some point, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number I did not recognize. I let it ring. Then it buzzed again with a text. It was brief, just a name and a question. Sarah Lynn asking if this was a good time to talk. I read it twice. Sarah Lynn. I knew the name. Thomas had mentioned her once when we were reviewing some documents years ago. He said she was thorough, that she did not waste words. I typed back that now was fine. She called almost immediately. Her voice was calm and direct. She said she represented the trust Thomas had set up and that certain conditions had been met earlier that evening. She said there were responsibilities I would need to understand, options I would need to consider. She said none of it needed to be decided tonight. I asked her one question. I asked if everything was as Thomas intended. She said yes. She said he had been very precise. We agreed to meet later in the week. When the call ended, I sat there in the quiet again, absorbing the weight of what was settling into place. I thought about Claire, about the life we planned, and the one she chose instead. I wondered if she was still sitting in that room, surrounded by people who were suddenly unsure how to speak to her. I wondered if she was angry or scared or relieved. For the first time, those questions did not feel urgent. I locked up the shop and drove home. The house was dark when I arrived. Claire was not there. Or maybe she was, and she did not want to see me. I did not check. I slept on the couch, shoes still on, the events of the night replaying in softer and softer focus until sleep finally took me. In the early hours of the morning, I woke up to the sound of snow falling against the windows. The house was still. My phone lay on the coffee table where I left it. No new messages. I sat there and realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by their expectations anymore. It would be shaped by my choices. That thought was both freeing and heavy. Outside, the sky was just starting to lighten. A new day was coming, whether I was ready or not. I stood up, stretched the stiffness from my back, and looked around the room one last time before heading toward the kitchen. There were conversations ahead, decisions to make, lines that could not be uncrossed. I knew that the hardest parts were still waiting, not in public rooms filled with applause, but in quiet spaces where words finally had to be said. The next few days moved slowly, as if time itself needed to catch up with what had happened. I went back to work the morning after Christmas because routine felt safer than sitting alone with my thoughts. The machines did not care about family drama or broken marriages. They needed attention, calibration, steady hands. I welcomed that. My crew noticed I was quieter than usual, but no one pressed. Men like us know when to leave space. When I got home that afternoon, Claire was there. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her coat still on, her purse beside her chair like she was ready to leave at any moment. The house felt smaller with both of us in it. She asked where I had gone the night before. I told her the shop. She nodded and stared at the tabletop. There was a long pause before she spoke again. She said she did not expect things to happen the way they did. I told her neither did I. That was the truth. She asked me what that man at the restaurant meant when he talked about authority. I told her it meant exactly what he said. She asked if it had something to do with Thomas. I said yes. Her face tightened. She said she wished I had told her. I said she never asked. That landed between us heavier than any raised voice could have. She stood up and paced the kitchen, hands pressed to her temples. She said she felt blindsided. She said she felt like she had been living next to a stranger. I listened. When she finished, I told her I felt the same way for a long time. We did not argue. There was nothing left to argue about. The papers on the table had already said what needed to be said. She picked up her purse and told me she was going to stay with her parents for a while. I nodded. I did not stop her. That evening, Sarah Lynn called again. We set a meeting for 2 days later at her office in Columbus. She suggested I bring any documents Thomas had given me. I told her I had them stored away. She said, "Good." Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who has seen worse situations than mine and navigated them without drama. The drive to Columbus gave me time to think. Snow lined the highways. Fields stretched out under a pale sky. I remembered making this drive years ago with Thomas, listening to him talk about things that mattered and things that did not. Money rarely made his list. Sarah Lynn met me in a small conference room with clean lines and no distractions. She was direct without being cold. She laid out the structure Thomas had set up years earlier, a trust, a series of holdings, legal control that shifted under specific circumstances. She explained that the dinner at the harbor room met those conditions because of the way certain actions were taken and certain documents were presented. I asked her why Thomas would do all of this without telling me. She said he believed people reveal who they are when they think no one important is watching. He wanted me to live my life without the weight of what he had built until I needed to understand it. She said he trusted my judgment. We went over responsibilities, options, what could happen next. She was careful not to overwhelm me. She said none of this required immediate action. She said the point was not to change who I was overnight. It was to give me control where I had never had it before. When I left her office, I sat in my truck for a long time before starting the engine. Control. That word felt strange in my mouth. I'd spent so long adjusting myself to fit into other people's expectations that the idea of not doing that felt almost reckless. The calls started coming in over the next week. Mark left messages that swung between anger and disbelief. Linda sent long texts about family and misunderstandings. Claire sent one message asking if we could talk later when things settled. I did not respond to any of them right away. Instead, I focused on small decisions. I met with Sarah again to understand the lease arrangements tied to the harbor room. She explained that certain businesses operated on properties held within the trust. She did not suggest I do anything about it. She simply made sure I understood what authority meant in practical terms. One afternoon, while I was at the shop, my phone rang with a number I recognized. Mark. I let it go to voicemail. He called again an hour later. I answered the third time because avoidance felt like another form of surrender. He did not bother with pleasantries. He demanded to know what game I was playing. He said I had humiliated him. He said I had no right. I listened until he ran out of words. Then I told him this was not a game. I told him I had spent years being talked down to in his home and in front of his guests. I told him that night was not about revenge. It was about reality. He said lawyers would be in touch. I told him they already were. That ended the call. After that, things shifted quickly. Sarah informed me that Mark had requested a review of his lease arrangements. She explained that his primary office complex was under a contract set to expire in early spring. She asked if I wanted to renew it. The question felt heavier than it should have. I did not answer right away. I asked her what renewal would look like. She explained the terms: fair market rates, no favors, no penalties, just business. I told her I would think about it. That night, I sat alone in the house and considered the power sitting quietly in my hands. I thought about all the dinners where Mark had spoken about consequences and leverage as if they were theoretical concepts meant for other people. I thought about how easily bitterness could take root if I let it. I slept on it. When morning came, my answer felt clear. I told Sarah I would not renew the lease. Not out of spite, out of principle. I said I preferred clean endings to long resentments. She accepted that without comment. She said she would handle the rest. Word traveled fast after that. Mark called again. His voice was different now, tighter. He asked if this was really happening. I told him yes. He asked if there was anything he could do. I said there had been, years ago. The silence on the line lasted a long time. Then he hung up. I expected to feel triumphant. I did not. What I felt was finality, like closing a door you know you will never open again. Claire came by the house a few days later to pick up more of her things. We spoke quietly. She asked if the lease situation was real. I said it was. She asked why I did not tell her sooner. I told her that some truths only matter when people choose to see them. She cried then, not loudly, just enough to show the weight of what she was losing had finally landed. I did not comfort her. I did not push her away either. I stood there and let the moment pass. When she left, the house felt empty in a way it never had before. Not lonely. Clear. That night, I went back to the shop and worked late. The steady rhythm of tools and machines grounded me. As I locked up and stepped outside, I realized that the public part of this story was over. What remained were the quieter consequences, the kind that unfold over time, the kind you cannot rush. I got into my truck and drove home, knowing that the next chapter would not be written in dining rooms or conference rooms, but in the choices I made when no one was watching. The following weeks settled into a pattern that felt unfamiliar, but steady. Like learning how to walk on ground that no longer shifted under every step. News about the lease traveled faster than I expected. Not because I announced it, but because people like Mark live in circles where information moves quietly and efficiently. Calls came from numbers I did not recognize. Messages arrived framed as concern or curiosity. I ignored most of them. The ones I answered were brief and practical. At work, nothing changed. The machine still needed care. Schedules still mattered. The guys noticed I was lighter somehow, less coiled. One of them asked if everything was all right at home. I said things were different now. He nodded and left it at that. Claire reached out again. This time she asked if we could meet somewhere neutral. Not the house, not her parents' place. We agreed on a small coffee shop near the river, a place we used to go when things were simple. She arrived early and sat by the window. When I walked in, she stood up like she was unsure whether to hug me. She did not. We sat across from each other, hands wrapped around warm cups. The space between us filled with things neither of us knew how to say. She asked how I was holding up. I told her I was doing all right. She said she had been thinking a lot. She said she felt like everything happened too fast. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I told her it only felt fast because the decision had already been made. She asked if I had ever planned to tell her about Thomas and the trust. I told her no, not because I was hiding it, but because I did not know what it would become. I told her I believed people should choose each other without conditions attached. She looked down at her cup and said she wished she had understood that sooner. We sat in silence for a while. She finally asked the question I knew was coming. She asked if things would be different if she had stayed. I told her the truth. That staying would not have changed what had already broken. That trust does not rebuild itself just because circumstances shift. Tears gathered in her eyes. She said she felt like she had lost everything at once. I told her loss rarely arrives one piece at a time. It tends to collect interest. We talked about logistics, the house, the timing. There was no anger left between us, just a shared understanding that whatever we had once been was finished. When we stood to leave, she thanked me for meeting her. I wished her well and meant it. A few days later, Mark requested a meeting through his attorney. I agreed on the condition that it be brief and direct. We met in a conference room downtown, neutral ground again. He looked smaller there, stripped of the stage he usually stood on. He opened with an apology that sounded practiced. He said he let his opinions get in the way of family. He said he never meant to hurt anyone. I listened and waited. When he finished, I told him I accepted the apology for what it was worth. I told him the decision about the lease would stand. He asked if there was room for negotiation. I said no. He asked what it would take to change my mind. I told him time would not fix what respect could have prevented. He leaned back and exhaled. He said he never imagined it would end like this. I told him endings are rarely imagined by the people who assume they control the story. That was the last conversation we had. The paperwork moved forward without drama. Sarah handled everything cleanly. She checked in occasionally to make sure I understood each step. I appreciated that she never treated me like a windfall client. She treated me like a person who needed clarity. As winter turned toward spring, I found myself with more space than I had known in years. Evenings were quiet, but not empty. I cooked for myself. I fixed things around the house without rushing. I took long walks along the river and let my thoughts come and go without chasing them. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of Thomas' belongings, I found a letter I had not seen before. It was sealed and addressed to me in his careful handwriting. Inside, he wrote about patience and choice. He wrote that people often confuse endurance with virtue. He wrote that there comes a moment when standing still is no longer honorable. He said he hoped I would never need what he set aside. But if I did, he trusted me to use it without becoming someone I would not recognize. He signed it simply. No advice beyond that. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I sat there for a long time after, thinking about the man who saw further ahead than I ever did. The shop expanded its hours. I hired a younger tech who reminded me of myself years ago. I paid him fairly and taught him what I knew. Passing on knowledge felt right. It felt like continuity instead of accumulation. People treated me differently now. Some with respect, some with caution. I did not lean into either. I stayed the same. The work grounded me. The routine kept me honest. One evening, as I locked up, I saw Claire's car across the street. She did not get out. She waited until I noticed, then waved. I waved back. She drove away. That was enough. I realized then that revenge had never been the point. Not really. What mattered was reclaiming the parts of myself I had given away in exchange for peace that never came. Walking away from rooms where my presence was conditional. Choosing silence when it served me and speaking when it mattered. The consequences continued to unfold, quietly and predictably. Mark moved his operations. The family adjusted. Stories were told in new ways. None of it required my involvement. As spring settled in, the river thawed, the air softened. I spent a morning repairing an old press, hands blackened with grease, sunlight cutting through the shop windows. I felt present in a way I had not in a long time. When I closed up that day, I did not rush home. I stood outside for a moment and watched the light fade. I thought about the path ahead. It was not glamorous. It was not loud. It was mine. I got into my truck and drove toward the quiet roads, knowing that what remained was not about settling scores, but about living with intention. The last of the noise had finally fallen away, leaving space for something that felt like peace. The months that followed did not rush past me. They unfolded slowly, like pages turning at their own pace instead of being forced. Spring came in quietly that year. The river thawed and the sidewalks filled again. I settled into a routine that felt grounded and honest. Work during the day, evenings at the shop or the house, simple meals, long walks, fewer words wasted on people who had already shown me who they were. The divorce finalized without drama. Claire and I signed what needed to be signed and stood on opposite sides of a table one last time. She looked tired, not angry. I felt the same. We wished each other well and meant it in the limited way two people can after everything that mattered has already been said. She moved on with her life. I stayed where I was. Mark kept his distance after the lease situation resolved. His business relocated. His influence shrank. Not overnight, but steadily. I heard pieces of it through other people. I never asked for details. What mattered to me was that the power he once held over my life was gone. Sarah continued to handle the trust matters with precision. We met occasionally to review documents and responsibilities. She never pushed me toward expansion or spectacle. She reminded me often that control did not require visibility. That aligned with everything Thomas had taught me. I kept the shop running the way it always had. I hired another technician, paid him fairly, took time to teach instead of rushing through explanations. The work felt more meaningful than ever. It was no longer something I used to prove my worth. It was simply what I did. One afternoon, while cleaning out a storage cabinet at the shop, I found another envelope from Thomas tucked behind a stack of manuals. It was thinner than the first letter. Inside was a short note written in the same careful hand. He wrote that people often mistake silence for weakness. He wrote that restraint is only a virtue when it is chosen, not when it is forced. He said if I ever wondered whether I waited too long, I should remember that timing reveals itself when you stop running from it. I folded the note and slipped it into my wallet. It felt like a quiet acknowledgement from someone who had always trusted me more than I trusted myself. Claire and I crossed paths once more late that summer. It happened at a grocery store on a weekday afternoon. We stood in the produce aisle, awkward but polite. She asked how I was. I said I was doing well. She said she was too. We smiled, not because everything was fine, but because enough time had passed for honesty to feel less painful. She asked if I was happy. I thought about it before answering. I said I was at peace. That seemed to satisfy her. We said goodbye and went our separate ways without looking back. Life settled into something quieter after that. Not small, just quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear yourself think and decide what matters without outside noise interfering. One evening, I sat on the porch of my house as the sun dipped low. I watched the light fade and thought about how much of my life I had spent trying to earn approval that was never going to come. I thought about the dinners where I stayed silent, the jokes I ignored, the ways I bent myself smaller to keep the room comfortable. I realized then that none of those moments defined me. They were chapters, not conclusions. What defined me were the choices I made when it mattered. Walking away instead of begging to stay. Choosing clarity over comfort. Letting go without becoming bitter. The truth is, revenge never crossed my mind the way people think it does. I did not wake up wanting anyone to suffer. I simply stopped allowing myself to be diminished. The consequences followed naturally after that. If there is anything I learned from all of this, it is that dignity does not need witnesses. It does not need applause. It shows up in quiet decisions made when no one is clapping and no one is watching. I still work with my hands. I still come home tired some nights. I still fix what is broken when I can and walk away when it is beyond repair. That part of me never changed. The difference now is that I no longer confuse endurance with loyalty or silence with strength. I speak when it matters. I leave when it does not. If you are listening to this and see yourself somewhere in these moments, sitting at a table where you feel smaller than you should, staying quiet because you think that is what love requires, I want you to know something. You are allowed to choose yourself without turning into someone you do not respect. You are allowed to walk away without proving anything to anyone. If this story made you pause or recognize a piece of your own life, take a moment and let that thought sit with you. I would like to hear what you would have done in my place, or what choice you are standing on the edge of right now. Share it if you feel ready. And if you want to hear more stories like this, about quiet turning points and the moments that change everything without warning, stay with this channel. There are plenty more paths worth walking together.